Today, we're diving into an impactful chapter in Hardeep Matharu's life and exploring how, when it comes to identity,
we need to start talking about identities.
It's these various identities that we explore in depth, starting with Hardeep's background and parents. Her mother from Delhi, her father raised in pre-independence Nairobi, and their eventual settlement in an area known for being home to the headquarters of the far-right group, the BNP. After graduating from a prestigious university, Hardeep faced a critical crossroads with a tempting job offer from a PR firm. The immense pressure of deciding her future led to a profound moment of vulnerability upon her return home. It was during this time, with the unexpected support of her driving instructor, that Hardeep confronted the challenge of aligning her personal dreams with the deep-seated expectations of her family and the cultural norms she was raised with. It's a bizarre series of events that eventually lead Hardeep towards journalism, driven by integrity rather than compromise, that adds further fuel to the profound internal conflict within Hardeep and each of us. Thank you so much for joining us. Genuinely it's a pleasure and a privilege actually to be able to host you and get to know you a little bit more.
No, thank you, Amar, because as we were talking just before we got going with the podcast, it's really good to be talking to you about some of the issues we'll delve into, because I just don't think they're discussed enough.
You're completely right that I think some of the conversations we were having even before we started recording, and some of the conversations that we'll obviously continue to have today aren't discussed enough generally. And I think even amongst our own community, a lot of the conversations are almost behind closed doors and they don't necessarily get the type of media time that I think they should get, or even just general time, just discussion amongst friends or family. I obviously want to go a little bit further back with your story. I think as we started, obviously Byline Times is where I think a lot of people would associate you and know you from. But going back to the beginning, to your family and background and ancestry, how does that, I guess, all accumulate and result and influence you and everything that you've been doing so far?
So I was born in London, in Greenwich, and my parents are Sikh Punjabi, both of them. Got slightly different stories though. So my mum was born and brought up in Delhi and moved to the UK when she married my dad. My dad was born and brought up in Nairobi, in British Kenya, as it was then. And he stayed there until he was about 17, and then briefly went back to India, which is where his parents were born. So his parents ended up in Kenya, but they were born in India. And they briefly went back there, and that was a couple of years before independence. And it actually wasn't anything to do with independence coming to Kenya, that being on the horizon. It was actually more a business move that they did, which in the end didn't work out really. So my dad was in India for about 1 or 2 years, and then he had a British passport. And he had met my mother during that time in India. Their families had been family, friends, knew each other. And by that time they were engaged. So my dad came to the UK, South London, and he already had family here. And so they brought me and my brother and my sister and me up in Southeast London. So about 25 minutes on a train from the centre in a place called Welling, which is quite interesting in that it's predominantly, it was quite a white area for many years and quite far right actually. So people always say to me, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? And I say Welling, and they're like, where's that? And I'm like, well, the only, unfortunately, way I always describe it is it's about a 5-minute drive from Eltham, where Stephen Lawrence was murdered. So that whole area was, maybe it's sort of less than now, but for many years was regarded as one of the last remaining far-right strongholds in Greater London. So it's a London borough, but it's quite sort of that way. And certainly growing up, it was that way because, we had a house on the street my parents still live on now. Our house was here, like maybe a minute's walk was my grandparents' house and my dad's parents. And opposite my grandparents' house was the headquarters. It was a bookshop, which was sort of not really a bookshop. It was the headquarters of the British National Party, the BNP, which was, quite prevalent back in the 90s and stuff. And I remember when Stephen Lawrence was murdered, they were marching outside our house. There were policemen on horses and all this stuff. So I grew up in that area. And I guess like a lot of people, we're Indian, right? We're a household, we're Sikh Punjabi immigrants. And we're very conscious that we're Indians, yeah? We're not white people, we're Indians. But the reality is that I'm living in Southeast London, Welling, BNP's opposite, in quite a white area. And we're living in British society. And the very society my parents are grateful that they came to for its opportunities. And so a lot of sort of emphasis on two things at once, which I think is again part of the conflict, the tension that people like us carry inside ourselves in different ways. So it's like you're Indian, we're Sikh Punjabi people, we can't forget that. We're going to go to the Gurdwara, we're going to try and, you know, understand Punjabi and what's going on. But then we're in British society, and you should try and, assimilate, basically. You should try and get ahead. You should try and take all the opportunities, and education is your passport. So you're living these like two lives, essentially. But even within that, there's a complexity, because my mum is Indian. So she only ever lived in India, came to Britain. She doesn't, I would say she's more has a philosophy and a worldview that is characterized by that. My dad grew up under the British in Kenya. And so his mentality is more British than it is Indian. To be honest, he's never identified with India, even though he's Indian. And growing up in these stratified societies of empire, where you're above the population whose country it is, Kenyans, and below the white British rulers, that has so much complexity around it. But these worldviews, my parents, they're very different things. So you're getting Indian, you're getting like almost imperial notions, African notions. They have opinions about each other. Then you got this, you're Indian, don't forget you're Indian, but you're in white society or British society. You should go to Cambridge, which I did law. You should do this stuff. And there's all this stuff going on. And then I guess to round out the answer, I also, so like my parents, in terms of, they're not, again, we didn't have lots of privilege growing up. Very normal house, very normal family. My dad worked for years, he was not university educated. My mum was in India, but when she came here, she couldn't speak English until I was about 15, 16 years old, and was looked after the kids in the house. And so we don't come from privilege or anything like that. But then I have this very interesting thing, like people don't think I'm Indian because I just look very different from my family, yeah? So I got red hair, freckles, I look quite white. Then I have this accent on top of that, whatever that means, however it changes. So there's all that going on. So there's that complexity I've described. Then there's the complexity of, even within my Indian culture, I've been othered in the case of, you're a coconut, you're a sellout, what do you know? Yeah, I've had these questions from my wider family. What do you know about Punjabi and Sikhism? What are you going to teach your kids about that? You're a coconut, you're this. And then so you're othered in the community you're kind of from, in your heritage. But it's clear that I'm not white. I'm not British. Yeah. So I'm othered in that community in a way people don't understand because I look white. So there's all of this stuff, and I think these intricacies are really hard to explain and get into. But that is kind of the journey I'm on now, is looking at all these various things and also looking for the universal things. Like there must be stuff in my experience, which relates to yours and other people, right? About these complexities.
But I think one thing that's interesting about the point about how there's a mixture within your family, so your father's from East Africa and under British rule and your mother's from India. One thing that I didn't realize, which is a lot of the Grenswick strike and a lot of kind of the strikes and the actions that take place from Asian communities during the, 60s, 70s, 80s, all of these women are from East Africa. And once that got pointed out to me, I was then like, hold on. So they've obviously been used to a way of life in wherever they were in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, wherever, a certain privilege. And then they've come to the UK and realized your color of your skin speaks louder than anything else. So they've lost that privilege. And only as a result of that have they then decided to take strike action. But I just think it's a very interesting point that actually it was women who were used to a certain level of privilege within a certain imperial structure that then kind of brought that over to the UK. One question that I have to ask is, how did your parents rationalize the BNP and like this whole, because the fact is on your front door, you can't really hide from it, right? Like we used to have BNP leaflets put through the letterbox and my mom would just rip them up and put them in the bin, and you can kind of hide from that. But it's on your front doorstep. Like, it's opposite your family's house. Like, there's no hiding. How did your parents try and rationalize that to you as a child? Or did they ever even acknowledge it?
Yeah, so the extraordinary answer is it wasn't really talked about. So we were aware that it was there, and we were aware that these rights had happened, especially when Stephen Lawrence was murdered. But it wasn't really talked about. And again, it's only something I'm looking at now as an adult. Like, And there's no judgment there. It's not like my
No,
parents
no,
should have done
no.
that or didn't. But I think you're left alone without realizing when you're younger and growing up as an adolescent into adulthood. Yeah, you're left with a lot of things on your own to try to make sense of and to understand. You're left sitting with a lot of complexity, and that is really difficult. So yeah, like you said, it was obvious that it was there, and we all knew in the household what that was about. But it's really interesting because I know other ethnic minority people, and of course there's so much variation within ethnic minority people, yeah? And I know other people whose parents have had conversations with them about, you are going to face racism in this country, and this is how you have to take it and deal with it, and that's what it's going to look like. My parents, for whatever reason, which I can speculate on or try and understand, didn't really do that. So they didn't really explain much about it. It was kind of unsaid that, yes, racism and the BNP exists literally on our doorstep, but it's not something we ever talked about in the home. Neither, and that goes for a lot of things. And I don't think I'll be alone in saying that. We didn't talk about racism. We didn't really talk about class that much. I can't, in terms of how I look, it was sort of, the gory, the porcelain doll, the men's side from my wider family.
Yeah.
It was like a special thing.
Colorism, yeah, is a massive thing, yeah.
But it wasn't like, does that, how does that sit with Hardeep? Like, kind of, she's nowhere in all these worlds and everything to everyone but not. Like, how does that sit? So it's not really dealt with. And I think coming back down to your thing about Kenya and stratified societies, it's really interesting because, like, we've had a lot of discussion in recent years, and I've done work on this as well. Priti Patel, Sweta Braverman, Rishi Sunak, what explains them all? And I've said, well, what's interesting about the experience of ethnic minority people is the same about the experience of empire. It's not a homogenous experience. And so empire absolutely was about white supremacy. It was about race and power and violence, especially with regards to Black people, slavery, all of that stuff. It was also about a group of ethnic minority people who were Asians, who were put in these stratified societies where they were middle class and they had some privilege. The complicating thing is that my dad, when I talked to him about this, said, well, it's difficult because he didn't feel Indian, even though he is Indian. He was never born there. But he was living in Kenya, which he loved, but he always knew it wasn't, he always described it as, but it was the Kenyans' country. So independence was a good thing. It wasn't our country. So this acknowledgement that he shouldn't really have been there.
Yeah.
But also, that being in that stratified society, he faced a lot of racism because there was a color bar even for the Asians. So he said to me, so I said to him, like, when you come to Britain, you must face racism. And he said, yeah, but that was normal because you had it in Kenya. You just got used to that. And I think that notion of there being a lot of pain probably around the racism that he faced in this country meant we didn't talk about racism in the home. So it's now it looks really extraordinary, but no one really talked about it. So I just tried to deal with it myself.
It's interesting how that privilege that a lot of Asians have in the UK is two-faced in that, we have the Sunaks and the Bravermans, who have managed to get up that grease pole. But on the flip side, there are entire masses that have been oppressed and left behind as a result of the trudging along of empire and that whole power structure.
I always say, like, Rishi Sunak, the thing that's really interesting about him is that he's the first Asian prime minister and the richest prime minister we've ever had. Both of those things are relevant because I was talking to a group of people the other day, and we were sitting in Tower Hamlets, and I said, how many people of colour growing up in Tower Hamlets in London would identify and relate to Rishi Sunak? So it's really interesting how a lot of discussion around people like Patel and Rishi Sunak, people who get to really positions of power, is it enough that they're people of colour? What is representation? What is true diversity? And I think class and life experience and background has a lot to do with it. It's really interesting, like how you say about how different people experience racism, which definitely exists. How is that experienced by people depending on who they are and who they're presenting to the world? And so what I always found questionable about Patel and some of Braverman's views, it's really hard to say because they're people of color, they should be left wing. They're individuals. And so if a white person can be an individual, why can't we be known as individuals? Why do we have to think a certain way? But then where it falls down is then they can be individuals and hold right-wing views, but then they have to apply that to everyone else. Everyone else is also just an individual. The people on the boats who risk their lives coming here are also individuals with their own stories, with their own ambitions in life. They've just had different life experiences. And I think when it comes to people like Priti Patel saying, I know what racism is because I experienced it in the playground, but that's about you. That's your experience. That will be different from your experience of being called the P word in a different context, or what, Black communities have faced. There are a lot of difference there. And so this notion that just because she was called the P word once gives her the license to understand all of racism and how it should be dealt with or not, it is problematic, I think. And I always acknowledge the privilege is that, I haven't faced the racism my dad has faced, who wears a bug or wore a bug for many years, or people like you who are more visibly Indian than me, I haven't. And I always acknowledge that. So how would I ever know your experience? But what's interesting about it is it's like multi-layered, because my experiences of it have been being with people, white people, British people, and them saying really honest views that they hold to my face, like, oh, I hate all these Indian people coming here and taking our jobs, to my face, using expletives, because they don't even think I'm Indian, even though they know my name. Or like my parents walking down the high street with me when I was like 3 or 4 years old, and my mum's in a salwar kameez, my dad's wearing a bog, and there's a police officer that comes up to them and says, what is going on? Why have you got a strawberry red-haired baby who looks white? Like, what is this? And so the only way they could prove to the police officers that I was with their child was they started speaking Punjabi with me. And as soon as I spoke back in Punjabi, they were like, this is our kid. I remember.
Amazing.
Yeah, the girls at school, there was me and, another Indian girl in my class, and we'd hang our blazers up in the cloakroom. And, the other white girls, oh, those two blazers smell of curry. So it's like, again, that's not anything that's as visible, but it's still othering as well.
Yeah, no, completely. I find it really interesting on the Sunak point. He's probably the furthest thing from what I would represent.
Mm-hmm.
How much of yourself do you have to sell in order to get to that point? Because I just can't, and again, it goes back to our experiences. My experiences would make me vomit if I got into that situation and sold everything out that I hold true. So like these stop the boats bollocks. Like the other day, the guy who was in one of the little boats people then drowned in was convicted of manslaughter or something, and it's all under Tory government changes to the law. And you're just thinking, how much more heinous can we make the situation? And especially when you put into consideration my parents, your parents, their parents, all benefited from, not literally small boats, but I know for a fact my grandma came in to this country in the 70s with my dad and his brothers as a refugee. So they didn't even have any status, and then they applied for it when they were here. Now, if we applied the same policies we have today, they'd have been sacked off to Rwanda by now. And again, we're going back to my own histories and obviously influencing the way I would carry those things out. But just coming back to yourself then, we obviously spoke about you growing up, being visibly different. Even the police officer, I think that story summarizes it quite brilliantly. How did your identity develop over that time? And how were, I guess, external factors like your family, living on a street where you've got the BNP marching, living in a predominantly white area, how did that all combine, I guess, to form the context? And how did that mold you, I assume, rather than influences? I guess it's actually mold you.
They're really good questions. I love the questions about. They're so interesting. I'll come to that.
Yeah,
I
please.
just want to pick up this point about Sunak, because I think it's interesting. And, because some of my journalistic work has been around trying to look at the complexities around people with white Patel and Sunak, because people are perplexed by it. And as a journalist, and I think it is right that I say this, like, I've never met them. So I don't know if I was to sit with them and say to them, do you feel like you have sold something of yourself in a philosophical sense about your identity. I don't know what they'd say. I've not put that question to them. So all I can really say is more general. But I think the general conversation about some of these dynamics is worth having. I don't think just because they're individuals and I've never met them and I don't know their history, doesn't mean I can't look at some of these strands.
And have an opinion as well. Yeah.
And I think in some ways, I think you're absolutely right about the privilege that Asian communities hold in this country. It's not really talked about, but it is. Ethnic minority experience is very different within itself. Asians within that have had a very different experience to Black communities in particular, I would say. I also think that when you've reached when you're in an industry like a profession like politics, and you're not even just in it as an MP, you reach a position where you actually have power. You're given power, you're in charge of big government departments, you're prime minister. You have essentially, I think what one could speculate is you may have internalized a lot of things. And one of the things you might have internalized is that your parents came to a country like Britain and they worked really hard and they made a lot of sacrifices in whichever way so that their children could grow up as individuals, people who were not defined by things like just their race or their gender. I think the issue there is that process is helped greatly by socioeconomic class, right? So if you're middle class, you have certain access and opportunities for certain education and opportunities, and that helps that. But if you've grown up in a way where you feel that the privilege your parents have given you is essentially to grow up in a Britain in 2024, where you are not going to be defined. You don't need to be defined by your race like your parents' generation was. You can become the prime minister. You can do... I think there's something about that experience that it's almost, you have more British than the British, the parents. The kids are always like more individual than individual.
It's like that goodness gracious
even
me
if
sketch.
they're going to be right-wing about it, like really right-wing. Because they're more individual than the individual. That is something their parents, their whole being has really been striving for. And I think what is in that dynamic as well, especially with East Africa, is this notion of privilege and stratification. I think that does have an impact on people. I think what also is an interesting dynamic to think about is the extent to which, colonized minds. Like my dad, was more British than he was Indian, living in Kenya. There was something about looking up to that culture, like accepting the narratives around it. And I think there's something about Britishness and British culture and whiteness, which transcends color even. It's sort of, what are the principles and values you have to espouse or you feel you need to in order to advance in a society like that? And I think with the Asian experience is particularly interesting because they have been more economically mobile and socially mobile than other minority communities. I think there's a lot within that is quite complex to look at, which is kind of relevant. But
no, you're right.
I can then come on to but you asked me about how did
adolescence happen? Yeah.
What did I have? What did I think about my identity? So, like I said, we're growing up and we're aware of all these things. We talk a lot about empire in my household, which is good. I liked that. I was very aware from a young age of the empire in India, the British Raj, Kenya, all of that. And Jallianwala Bagh massacre, all of this stuff. So that was very emphasized to me.
And how did your parents, so for argument's sake, I think the way you encapsulated it, being more British than the British is perfect. And it reminded me of the goodness gracious me sketch when it's like the Coopers. And I think that's it's a tongue-in-cheek way of kind of condensing what you're saying into a few kind of funny minutes of comedy. But my question with that, and it kind of relates to the Asian experience in Africa, which isn't much of it power dynamics. So as long as the Asians got power, they were happy to be in that position. And so and what I mean is that then the flip side of that is that, so your father obviously has a particular view of Britishness and what that means, but then he's also aware of Jallianwala Bagh. So how do you square those circles, or how do you connect? And again, I don't know, maybe they don't.
But it's that complexity you have to sit with.
Yeah.
And so I think of it like recently I've been giving the analogy of a cube. You can only understand what a cube is by the structures and dimensions of it only make sense if you can look at that side, then turn around, look at that side, right? A cube is only a cube if you can look at all the sides of it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean one side is more important than the other. They're all
But if you're looking just at one side,
it.
it's not a
Just
cube
looking at one
anymore.
side,
Yeah.
but I agree with you. So I think it's interesting because unlike some of the more high-profile people we know of, politicians and their backgrounds in East Africa, my family's background, it wasn't, they were middle class in that it was a stratified society, but economically they weren't sort of well off, and they weren't business people. They weren't owners. They didn't have businesses or anything like that, and actually went back to India for an opportunity that they thought would work out better. So they weren't really privileged in that sense. And it's, again, this dichotomy of they were middle class, and you're right, they really liked that. And it's really interesting. I found some going through my dad's dad, who's born in India, moved to Kenya, which is where he had his children.
Do you know why he moved?
I don't actually know why.
Okay, because I can never explain it either. Yeah, same.
But I found some of the scrapbooks he had made of old photos when he was living in Britain before he died. And it was really interesting because there was all these pictures of very interesting life in Kenya, in British Kenya, him and his friends and family, and how they traveled all around Mombasa. They went to Uganda, like really interesting. But then but there was a sense that he didn't agree with the empire in India. My dad's name is Swaraj, right? So my grandfather was very like, the British shouldn't be in India. Like, that is not right. But he enjoyed kind of life in Kenya. So my dad, like, kind of, he told me when he still second-class citizens in the UK, but liked the British and identified with it more than your own Indian culture. These complexities have to be looked at and sat with. You can't, how the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. You need to know about the empire growing up.
Yeah.
But then, more British than the British, we vote for Brexit because we don't feel a connection to Europe. We're the empire.
That's
We're
crazy.
The old empire.
Yeah.
So there's all of this. So it's so complicated. And I think what I find as a journalist, as anyone who's trying to partake in public discussion and life in this country at the moment, everything is so polarized. It's so binary.
Yeah.
And for me to say that some people found privilege and opportunity in empire should not and does not in any way take away from the people for whom it was just awful and just violence and just nothing of opportunity. Coming back to how, like, so all of this was going on, and I guess growing up, it was a lot of having to sit with all of this on your own. There's a lot of, as you know, there's a lot of silence. The silence speaks volumes. A lot of repressed, unprocessed dynamics within our community, I would say. I can begin to unpick some of those of my own accord. It's not easy. It's quite lonely. There's not many people, even our own age, that you can readily talk to this stuff about. There is also this taboo of you don't talk about that stuff as kids, even with other people your age. There's that. But how I ultimately dealt with it, I think, was... And I'm kind of on a journey at the moment in my life now, I'm mid-30s, deconstructing some of this. All of my 20s, I basically had transcended it all. I was basically like, I'm Indian, but I'm othered in my community, so I'm not really Indian, but I'm Indian, completely Indian. Then I'm British and I'm white, I look white, but I'm not really white, I'm othered in white community. Then I ended up studying law at Cambridge University. And so in a way, that was like my parents' ultimate.
Yeah. Every Asian parent's ultimate goal, right? Yeah.
That's it. And you're carrying it for them, it's there on their shoulders.
You're standing on the shoulders of giants.
So you're there. And then I went to university and I didn't really speak Punjabi anymore. I used to speak it with my mum and I wasn't speaking all the time. To stop speaking Punjabi, the accent got much more cut class. Deconstructing myself, it became what people saw was a posh, privileged white Cambridge girl. And this carried on for a while. And I think it was an attempt to transcend this complexity. This, like, is it this or is it this? And I was just like, I'm going to go with this. But it didn't get rid of the complexity. And it was only about 3 years ago that, just due to some family circumstances, so I sort of moved out of my family home where I lived until about 5 years ago. in order to try and be the kind of journalist I wanted to be. It's very hard. And I had the privilege of being able to live with them. And so even when I moved out and then some family circumstances happened that made me look at it all again, and I thought, you can't transcend this stuff. You have to descend into it. You have to descend into the complexity.
You have to own
it. You have to own it, integrate it, understand it, try and really look at it. And actually, Amar, there is no solace in that. There is no bow at the end.
There's no
There's
conclusion.
no conclusion. There's no like, well, that's contradictory.
No.
And why did you do that?
Because tomorrow something else happens and you're like, well, how does that fit? Yeah.
And it's not like everyone suddenly not repressed, has sorted out all their...
It's all like rainbows and candles, right?
Like there's still lots of unprocessed generational, intergenerational traumas or mental health issues or dynamics haven't been looked at. It doesn't all get sorted out, but I realized that you have to descend into this stuff, and you can't wait for the world to recognize who you are. You got to know your own story.
Yes.
And if you know your own story, then it doesn't really matter if you just think I'm a posh white girl or you think I'm a coconut, or someone's like, oh, you're really Indian. Why do they say you're a coconut? And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
That doesn't
matter.
You've got to know who you are.
Yeah.
Because the world is always going to try and put interpretations on you. And as a journalist as an editor of a newspaper, you're a representative naturally. Yeah. And you're always going to get these interpretations. And the more people I meet, they're just like, you don't fit in any one box. But before, when I was trying to transcend the complexity, that worried me. I was like, oh God, how do I have all these different things?
Yeah.
Now I'm like, wow, I don't fit in any one box. I have there's lots of stuff going on.
I've got my own box, which is hybridized of all these other boxes.
That's rich. I love being Indian. I want to be, I love being Indian. I'm not white, I'm Indian.
Yeah.
But it's being able to get to the stage where, without any kind of guidance, to be able to say, I can own this stuff, or start to try and look at it. And I think this is the conversation. I'm always amazed. I sit in Ubers or just get talking to people in shops, serving in shops and stuff, Indian people of similar background. And there's one Uber driver where we talk about these family dynamics. People don't say things that are obvious, and how that sits with people, and people like us growing up in one culture, but our parents from another, and how we navigate. And I said to this Uber driver, like, do you talk about this stuff, which is like bread and butter for us people? Yeah. Do you talk about anyone? And he was like, no, not really. And that's amazing, isn't it? And I think there is something about it being marginalized. There's this notion of the Asian community is one of privilege within ethnic minorities in this country. Also, we've got prime ministers and stuff. So what problems could there be with us? But that means it's slightly marginalized. And part of it is also the community itself doesn't readily want to talk. Oh. We've now got some people who are Satnam Singera, and people written about their histories and how they grew up and mental health and all this stuff. It's very good. But still, we've all internalized this kind of things on that, but things are good for us. We're privileged, so we just need to. But it's not always as simple as that, I think.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that. Things are good for us, so we won't make any noise. And I think that's very much been. And again, I just go back to like the Southall uprising or riots or whatever you want to call it. Much of that was led by the youth, and a lot of these things were led by the generations that came after. And so I'm just completely shooting off the hip here, but I just wonder how much of the fact that they were British by birth factored into then these people going, well, hold on, I shouldn't be treated like this just because of my skin color. Whereas their parents may have very much been like, I'll just shut up and take it because I just need my job. And it's just interesting how those dynamics change. You mentioned obviously you went to Cambridge and did law. Surely at that point your family must be like, she's made it gold complete, like we don't need to worry about her anymore, and like off she goes. And your point about like the language and learning English in a particular tone, like going to school, you just naturally pick up a lot of the colloquialness and the slang that happens. And I remember a lot of the time going home and talking and then being told that's not the Queen's English, and that isn't how you're going to get a job, and that isn't how you're going to get employed. How much of that do you think is driven by that typical Asian need for your child to want to go into a job that they don't have to then worry about pay or whatever? And then for me, growing older, the way I viewed it was how that type of question of pronunciation feels like you're deciding between whiteness and then whatever I want to talk. Like, why do I have to follow these rules of how you pronounce X, Y, and Z? I know there's common sense to that too, right? Like, I'm not trying to throw the whole thing out. But how did you view it at that time? And how now, looking back, do you think that, like, how do you view it now as well, I guess? Like, do you look back and go, hold on, maybe that decision was made out of, from this place, rather than, I don't know, thinking about something, I don't know, your identity or something else? Like, what was it that was the bit where you go, hold on, like, why did you want to transcend that, I guess, is actually the question. Like, why were you like, forget this, I'm just going to not change, but I'm going to work on my language and I'm going to talk in a particular manner. Like, what was the driving force, or what was the thought behind it, I guess?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just, there's so much complexity within my personal experience of my identity. So there's like me, then there's the me influenced and molded even unconsciously by my immediate surrounding, my family, their views of education. Then there's the me that's molded by our wider culture. And so there's kind of like, there's me. So there's like different versions of who I am, even by this point. And I'm only 18. And that isn't something that's necessarily completely encouraged, but it's not discouraged because there's no talk about any of it. So it's just these internal processes within myself, which are largely unconscious. And for me, it was just like really complicated to keep being, and also like being practical, like, well, I need to get a job eventually. And that there's a lot of pressure to do that in our culture as well, and get a job that's a professional job. And to do that, what do I need to be and become? And so I was just like, there's too much going on here. Like, I can't deal with it. It's overwhelming. And again, these are normal things I don't think people talk about. You don't have to, it's very like popular, like pop psychology at the moment. But I think there's something in this notion of defining difficult experiences don't have to be just, you know, the obvious ones that we know about, like abuse and physical sort of suffering. It's also like all of these ways in which we're molded, all of the deficits of, you know, I had no one to talk to about my identity and how to navigate it and what that meant and what kind of job would I want and how is that different from me as a person. And that in itself is quite complicated, and we should all be encouraged to talk about it more because it's just completely normal. And I think we'd be living much more freer lives if we did. So for me, it was like, this is complicated. And I got this place at Cambridge. So I was like, well, that kind of simplifies it a bit anyway. And yeah, you're right. That should have been the end of the story. Like, it should have been like, that's it. But so I got there, and it was the first time I was ever away from home. Yeah. So it's just the first time I was in a different environment.
And then you're also with other people who aren't like you. That makes those comparisons.
And I was just like, oh, great, a lot. I mean, I enjoyed my degree, and it's been really useful for my work as a journalist, to be honest. But what I realized from it was, I mean, I thought it'd be more philosophical about justice than it was, especially at Cambridge. But it wasn't. It was more practical about the city law firms and that sort of thing. That was what I was driving towards, I felt. But what I really loved was just talking to people. So I would talk, having in-depth conversations and asking questions. And so by the time I left, I graduated, I got my degree. I was like, I just need a career where I honestly keep exploring in a wider sense. So I went back to my mom and dad, and they were like, so...
Law. When you begin as solicitor.
You getting a job in this? And I was like, no.
Which law firm?
Because I couldn't. I did 10 interviews for law firms in London, and they all knew I didn't really want the job, so I failed all of them. And I still put myself through it. And I was like, it was my sister, who is a solicitor, and who said, do you really want to do this, or just do something else? Like, what's going on? And so there was a lot of pressure. And it comes back down to these really big questions, which that's what the transcending's about. These questions are so big. Who am I? And who is the Hardeep Matharu for everyone else? And that girl who's for everyone else is carrying all these hopes and dreams inside of herself for other people.
Yeah.
So that they're living through her. Also, my parents, there's no notion of you could be a journalist or do something that's not a professional settled career. They don't have the contacts or knowledge, anything about it. Like, and it was also a status thing, being a lawyer, being a doctor, being that's a status thing, and that's important within our culture.
And they love telling everyone, my daughter's a solicitor.
It's all about keeping up appearances.
Yeah, completely.
So I think I don't regret doing it at all, and everything is a learning curve. But I think once I did it, it kind of ultimately took the pressure off, because I know again, that's a little privilege of my own. I had finally done the law degree. I did it from Cambridge. And in my opinion, like, I've done that now.
Now I can do my thing.
But now I'm still on that journey of,
Yeah,
like, who am I?
Does
What's
it
my
ever
voice?
end? Yeah.
Like, this thing about accent. You know, and I'm being really honest here.
Definitely.
I still have not found where my voice literally sits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm talking a bit differently to you than I do maybe when I'm doing public appearances in a different context. I'm really aware of that. I don't know. I haven't found my voice yet.
Yeah.
That's okay too.
Yeah,
You can
yeah.
still be a journalist in this world where you need to know everything about everything and have an opinion about everything. I'm saying, well, I don't know my voice. It changed. You know, it became really kind of cut glass. That's kind of who I'm with. Why? It was because of the people around me. It was really ironic because when Rishi Sunak and Priti Patel, all these politicians came to power, people, again, both have effects. And people would say to me, generally, oh, was Cambridge diverse? And I said, no. On one hand, absolutely not. Because in terms of people, Black people, there were like a few, 2 or 3 in the whole year studying law. But it was completely diverse because I have never met so many Asian people anywhere. Like, I got to university and it was like a lot of people who were Asian who had grown up in North London, gone to similar schools. I'd never heard of these schools and just had lots of contacts, already knew each other. They were really confident, you know, really middle class, very successful families, a lot of East African connections. I mean, they didn't really talk to me before they found out my name was Hardeep because they thought I was white. So it was, and they're really nice people. I like them a lot. And that's like, so when that class of people like Patel and Sunak, and for me, I met those people at Cambridge. So again, this privilege of Asian people. And to a certain extent, my accent changed because to me, they were quite posh Indian people. Not my close group of friends, but this wider group. It was like, they're really, it actually came from them. It kind of influenced how I spoke. And
it's interesting. I just find these conversations interesting because for me, a lot of those questions about language was like, do I want to sound, and again, being like quite blunt, do I want to sound like the white guy in a suit who's going to get the job? Or do I want to be what I think is maybe a little bit more authentic? But again, those practicalities come into play, and you can't, like, it's like those tests that come out, the studies that come out, and it's like, oh, if you put an African name or an Asian name on a CV and you send it in, you're, I don't know, however many less likely to get it. Now, if you apply that then to language, how much worse must it get? So, yeah, like, as in, there is some assimilation that whether we like to or not, we have to. Like, as in, like, you have to. As in, I would like not, deep down inside, I'd like my language to be different. But I know the audience that I want to attract probably isn't going to be attracted to me talking in lingo and slang and stuff like that. So again, it's just those complexities really do start to add up the more you kind of dive into it. And then one thing that you started off with at the beginning was about how you didn't feel like you fitted in any box, and that the kind of people around you may have felt they did. And that's something that I felt growing up as well. But I think one thing that I've come to understand a bit more recently is that actually the people who purport to be of one box have just never looked. Because actually, once you start digging, it's even like when British are like, oh yeah, go home. And I'm like, okay, I'll go to Coventry. Exactly. And then you're like, you go home. And then I'm like, well, actually, your ancestry is probably from Denmark or somewhere along like the north of France. So or maybe you're actually Roman. Like, how far do you want to take this, right? And so I think you're completely right. The more we as a community and as individuals take a look at our own complexities, and the more we can share and discuss those, the better for not just us for sharing it, but for others as well,
so
right?
Right, Amar, because I think, again, from a more journalistic perspective, there's a lot of talk about identity politics.
Yeah,
it's everywhere. Like identity politics, wokeism, fights about statues, all this stuff. But I just think it's interesting because identity is a really important topic to discuss. Like, well, look how much time we're spending talking about the intricacies of it. Absolutely it is. And I think for the generations that came before us, it was really important, not just as a conceptual way, in a practical way of getting people's rights and making sure those are safeguarded, and you know, saying we're here and we're equal to you. And for that, identity was very important, not just for people of color or different ethnic minority groups, women, LGBT people. So that was all very necessary. The problem it is, like with anything, if it's sort of taken almost so far that you then end up back in a box that you wanted to get out of to begin with, it becomes too much at its sort of more detrimental end. It can be too much about categories, because the categories themselves have to be multiple, right? So our category broadly is ethnic minorities. Look how different we are.
Yeah.
Look how different we'd be to like anyone else who is an ethnic minority. So the category itself isn't multiple. And this thing that I've been writing about in the last couple of years, when it comes to identity, we need to start talking about identities. We need to, as you say, be more comfortable with the complexities within us. Because when I'm saying I'm trying to transcend something, what I'm actually trying to transcend is my multiple identities. I'm here with you, and I could give an interview to the industry magazine Press Gazette, and I'd be Hardeep, the editor, who maybe talks a bit more like this, and that changes a bit. You know, I'm being honest, maybe. And then there's like the me who goes home, has chicken and joel with my parents. Then there's the one who's my friends who are from Cambridge. And that's just normal. Everyone has that. It's not just about being Indian. Everyone has multiplicity about them. And also, just from a psychological point of view, like I'm really interested in psychotherapeutic philosophy. Carl Jung, you know, the famous psychiatrist, he was all about, you know, the conflicts within. So we all have these tensions within us. Like there's a part of me that would have quite wanted to be a barrister and be up there and be like, yeah, I could be QC, KC. But then there's a part of me who's like, no, that's not, why would it be, that's a role I'd be playing. I don't want to do that. I just want to be Hardeep. And, you know, like, there's all these conflicts within us, these tensions, they're just normal. That's like anyone in life has those. And I think we don't really talk about it. We reduce it to we have to be this one cohesive identity, which is what I thought I needed to be. So I was trying to transcend all of these multiplicities to be like, if I can just now got the law degree, I can just present this, I guess, in a way to the world. Where it all fell down, of course, was it's, again, coming back down to this thing, which I think people of our background feel more acutely, but is a universal thing. Yes. Who we are, like who we want to be in life, who we naturally are, our tendencies, our instincts, our interests, our talents, our potentials. And then who does the world say we are? And I think for our communities, my experience has been that is heightened. There is such a heightened pressure of this job, this partner, this is where you need to live. I mean, get a mortgage, don't rent. That's a waste of money, apparently. Like, you know,
you know, but that's very Asian. You have to own a home.
So you have to own a home, and otherwise you have to stay at home. Like, like all of these things, you know, we internalize them and normalize them. And I guess that's why my kind of perspective has always been regarded as quite interesting. Not just because of how I look, which is a bit different, not in a box. But I've also critiqued my own, I'm ready to critique my own culture. I love being Indian. There's aspects of it I really love. I don't know, I have to admit, I don't know as much about Sikhism in depth as you do, Omar. It's not something I grew up with in that sense, although my parents are very, very much would say they're Sikh. But there's bits about it that I don't like, which are also apply to different other cultures too. Like I really don't like gender norms. They're still it's still very patriarchal, still an expectation of women. I don't like this notion of keeping up appearances. So it's like, what are you doing compared to that person's kid? And which school did you go to? I mean, that is just, again, these comparisons, these measurements that then we internalize. We can't talk to anyone about them. No. All of this stuff, I don't really like any of that stuff. I have to, and this caution, this fear. So it wasn't like, go and do journalism. My parents like, how are you going to do journalism?
Now
and then that anxiety gets poured onto me. So I'm like, how am I going to keep the whole now I pulled it off. You know, but the journey to it was like, I've already got all this kind of why are you doing this? For what reason? And it's just that none of this is discussed. No. And I think it's really important that we look at it. So multiplicity, it's exactly what you said. As long as we can discuss the complexities within us, we have a more universal connection to everyone. And we can say, this is true, but this is true too. Like my parents voted for Brexit, and they think Jallianwala Bagh massacre is horrendous.
Thing is I think a lot of people listening to that may be like, what the hell? But I remember, and bless his soul, the chap that I'm gonna recount, he's I think it was his 10-year like budsy or deathversary like a few months ago. Really, really close family friend. And I remember going to their house after school one day, and this was when there was like a big inpouring of Romanians just coming into the country, maybe like, I don't know, early 2000s-ish, maybe 2010s-ish. And he was just sat there effing and blinding. Why are they coming here and take usual like stupid, crappy arguments? Why are they taking our jobs and housing and this? And I must have been about 15, maybe 14. Like and even that, I was sat there going, what in the world? Like, do you not realize that you're a refugee and that you came in the same circumstance and that you like? It just baffled me. And then obviously we get to Brexit, and turns out a lot of Asians voted for it. And at first I was scratching my head being like, what in the world? And again, going back to like at the beginning, you were mentioning how to some degree there would be an assumption with Asians that we should be left wing. So there was almost like an assumption of like, what? Like he shouldn't be saying this. But when Brexit came, I think a few things fell into place, which is we're very much about preserving our own, and we're very much about, well, if this ensures that I don't get taxed more, or I get to keep X or whatever it is, then I'll vote for it. And it feels almost the opposite of what you should do. Like, as in, I just find it a short circuit when I'm told people from ethnic minorities vote for Brexit. I can understand why, like I get the reasoning, but I'm just like, what? And again, same thing with Matey cussing out the Romanians. It doesn't add up, but yet I think we strive so hard to get accepted and kind of want to be
more British than the British.
Yeah, more British than the British, that we then internalize. And I think ultimately that like complexity, and I like your word of complexity, because for me, I've always seen it as a binary, but actually it's far less a binary, because there's like areas of grey where actually these decisions are being made almost on the fly. Like I'm sure he didn't like write a script about the Romanians. It was very much like, oh, this is how I feel or whatever, right? I'll have to change the battery. Damn. Give me 1 second. Sorry.
No, it's alright. I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you.
It's a great chat. I love it.
Thank you. I always.
We'll come back to this point, 'cause it's
Yes, yeah. I'm always curious. I'm like, I hope the questions go okay.
I love it. It's so interesting. Honestly.
No, thank you.
Really interesting.
Yeah, it obviously means a lot as well, coming from someone who's actually a journalist. Like, I just
These
have
are
a
brilliant
laptop.
questions. No, brilliant questions. Because you're actually asking things.
Yeah.
Not just like.
And getting into it, like, as in, like,
You're
how do
going
I connect
deeper.
to it? Yeah.
And how do you connect to it? And what are some of these dynamics and strands? Great. So you were saying about Brexit. Like,
Yeah.
how
So it short circuits my brain that we have ethnic minorities who, and I understand the reasons as to why they think that, but it just shortcuts my brain as to how they even get to those conclusions.
how they get to conclusions. Yeah. It's really interesting what you said about complexity rather than binary.
Binaries, yeah.
I like this. There's something in this. Because basically, my understanding of it is that, I mean, I guess that something like the referendum was asking for a fixed. It was binary. It was in, out. So it was binary. It was looking for a binary response from people. But I think what it brought out in all of us, because we had to have a binary choice, was a more fixed notion of identity for some people. And so, like the man you're talking about with the Romanians or my parents voting for it, it's like in that moment, their identity is British, more British than the British. We're British, and we agree with the arguments being made about immigration or the EU. We don't have any connection to it. We were the countries of empire. We fought in world wars for this country. So their allegiance shouldn't be to Europeans. It should be to, if it's going to be to any people, migrants, it should be us. But in that moment, those identities become quite fixed, when really there's a whole load of complexity that they're not conscious of or even able to hold or understand. So really, like the complexity of all of the actual, because it wanted a binary response, but the complexity of it is that it's because their journeys have been so hard that now they finally feel some acceptance, some assimilation, some respect of kind in this society. It's almost like they feel so secure in a way that they voted for Brexit. But then that they also feel insecure as migrants. And it's the insecurity that always, and so on one hand, they feel like they're not migrants, they're British. But then they never forget that migrant experience, because I don't think that is something you can just forget. You carry it with you, it's in you. And so this thing, which was a binary choice, is actually very complex. But what happened was a lot of the campaigning around it made it very binary, made it very simplistic. And these are complex things. But I have to admit, I don't know, like the generations above us, Summer, I don't think, they didn't sit around thinking about complexity. It's a privilege. We get to sit here because of what they did.
Because of the work they did and the fact that...
So we can now sit and be like, oh, there's all this complexity, and they don't even look at it like that.
They didn't have the time to do that.
They're not like, if I said to my dad, you feel like a second-class citizen in this country, and you've said that at times, but you also feel more British than the British. So, but the question isn't even which is it. It's, as you're saying, how does that go together?
How does that blend?
How does that blend? But I've never asked him, because it's not something he's ever considered. Like, he's aware, if I ask him one thing, this is his opinion, and so I am aware of the contradictions. And I think those contradictions are things that we play out, we live with, because we're living in a world that's quite different from the ones our parents grew up in. And so in a way, we're more able to see the contradictions, but and don't live as simplistically as it's this or it's this. But our parents aren't that simplistic either. It's just more...
I guess with our parents, though, their priorities and the generations before them, their priorities were more so get a job, make the money, settle down, get the house, get the kids into good education so they don't have to go through the struggles we did. They may have wanted to have had those conversations, but having the chance to have those conversations is obviously a different matter. Do you also think, though, that the benefit our generations have and the generations coming beyond us is also the fact that there's not just access to information, but also the time? So again, going back to the generations before us, they're busy getting jobs, working. Like, I know my grandma worked pretty much every factory job she could find, as soon as they got here, just to make sure her kids had food on the table. My grandfather died quite soon into them coming here, so she was on her own bringing up 3 boys. But for argument's sake, your example of Brexit and then people being like, well, hold on, the British Indian Army fought alongside the Brits in World War One and World War Two, and therefore there should be arguably more allegiance, say, to India than to the EU, hypothetically, right? Isn't a lot of that based on a very general popular understanding of history? And then that goes back to my point, which is they may not have had the time or the access, whereas we now have time and access and the privilege to do both of those things, to go and then dig a bit deeper, because then for argument's sake, all right, yeah, cool, yeah, British Indian Army fought alongside in World War One and World War Two, that's fact. But so is Jallianwala Bagh, and so is using aeroplanes to bomb Gujranwala around the same time. And you can go on, like the list is just massive if you want, I don't know, blowing up Namtari prisoners from the end of cannons. Yeah, like the list, it's just heinous. And obviously we can get into the agenda of wanting to push a particular narrative and a particular popular history within the general public. But I kind of feel as though all of those things have helped us have these conversations, because those generations assumingly didn't have the access and didn't necessarily have the time to have those conversations.
No, you're right. And also, like, just even thinking about the Brexit vote, this notion of Europe, like even growing up, it wasn't something, I mean, I went to India when I was 4 years old, very recently just went to Kenya, but or visited a few other places in Asia, but never, it sounds weird or sounds funny to think, but Europe was on our doorstep, and it wasn't ever. I've only been visiting European capitals since Brexit, because I'm like, oh, this is like,
this is it,
and it's amazing, and that my family don't have any natural affinity to Europe. They don't want to go for a weekend in like Lisbon or like Milan, or it's not. I'm generalizing in a big way, but I think that wider conception of, so we now can look back and look at the world wars, look at empire in a way that it wasn't even looked at 20 years ago. Now we're looking at it and being like, wow, look at all of this, including all the complexities. And we're also looking at the present and forward, and looking at Europe, for example, and how connected Britain, as it is to Europe. Like that was always the case. We were in the world wars to support our allies in Europe. At the same time as we had the empire.
Yeah, completely.
So I think it's really interesting, like how we conceive of even our place in the world, and the notion that, like, I'm born in London, I live in London, I'm a Londoner, mostly because of the multiplicity I feel it represents. That's an obvious answer. A lot of people say that. They feel like London is international. And I feel like that, but for me, that is something about being Indian as well. It's about being other and not fitting anywhere. I feel London represents not fitting anywhere. But I don't think my parents are attached to London. Like, I don't think they would say they're Londoners. They're not Londoners. They're British, first and foremost. And so even how we think about these things. But I think moving towards a place where we're all, especially our generations and the ones that come after us, this multiplicity, you don't have to be one thing or another. And I think a lot of people felt that with the Brexit referendum, because it was a binary choice and because of the way it was then handled, people felt like they had to pit their British identity against a European identity, and that caused a narrowing. Whereas I think the only way to operate in the world we're in now, where everything is climate change is causing migration, and this is all going to accelerate. It's thinking in a bigger sense and a wider sense. But it's interesting. I learned a lot about Indian history and the empire growing up. I didn't necessarily learn about European history and so it was quite it was quite centric to that.
I just find it interesting because what is it? Where was I going to go with this? Completely lost my train of thought. I've completely lost what I was going to say. Oh God. Anyway, when it comes back to me, I will go back to that. Just trying to think now. Okay, yeah, no, completely lost it. My brain gone blank. Oh yeah, that was it. Which is, so the conversation on identity and Britishness and I guess nationality or whatever is really interesting because, so I'm obviously aware I'm British by birth, but if someone asked me, do you feel British? I'd say no, because to me, British means certain things. But then when you go to Europe and when you are in somewhere that isn't Britain, you very quickly realize how British you are. So if I'm saying going to America, they don't queue. Like, to me, that's British. You queue if you're British, right? And then yet, if someone was to say, do you have any allegiance to any nation? I'd be like, well, no, because burn all nation states to the floor and let's start again, right? But that's quite a radical idea to have. I just disagree with the whole idea of nation states, which is a different argument completely in itself and is a bit of a tangent. But then if someone was to ask, am I Indian? I'd be like, well, no, not really. I don't feel Indian. I have an affinity to Punjab. Yes, it's part of India, but do I feel Indian? Like, and again, coming to the point, which is like, India is massive. Like, as in just, even the term South Asian, all right, cool. That's a whole confusion in itself. But then even India, like, what does that mean? To some people, it's right-wing Hindu, BJP and all the rest of it. But that's a very particular slice of India. And so, I don't know, I just think, as we've been talking about identity, I've just been mulling it over in my head, which is, and you don't have to have an answer, which is those complexities exist within us all, whether we like to go into it or not. And I don't have an answer. I guess by passport, I'm British. What do I feel? I don't feel any particular nation. Like, but again, like, what is your nationality, or what is your, I don't know what the word is, like, how do you become to feel that you have an affinity to X? Because I could say I have an affinity to Jamaica because I like reggae music. I wasn't born there, but I've got just as much of an affinity really as to India. I wasn't born there either. So I don't know, I'm like, as in just the further you start to go into these things, the further you're like, I've got no idea.
Yeah,
and it's okay.
And that's okay, yeah. Exactly. And that's like, again, it's like looking at the complexity, as I said it previously, it's not like you end up with a big bow at the end and it's the solution is there. It's often just more questions.
Yeah.
And that is okay. Sitting with that complexity and unsettledness is okay. So I think the identity politics and the sort of the bit of the spectrum we're on with identity now is, again, the boxes that people were trying to escape from. So it's maybe too many categories and labels, which mean that you've got to be this or that. So it's in a paradoxical way, it's gone back to this notion of defining somebody by a cohesive version of themselves.
Yeah.
And really, it's like, no, you don't have to do that. You can just be aware of, well, I feel this way about this, but that's not clear cut, and that's not. And it's just being aware of the complexities, but not being, and that's what I'm doing. You know, I was saying I was trying to transcend that process. Now I'm in my descent. I call it my descending into it. The descending isn't like, oh, I'm going to fix it all in the end. The descending is like, there's more questions, there's more complexities. All I'm trying to do with the descent is feel more secure in all of the unsettledness and the complexity.
You're accepting your complexities rather than trying to run off and get above them, right?
And create a sort of full sense of security and safety.
Yeah.
And also, I think one of the most important works I ever read was only a couple of years ago by Amartya Sen. It's a brilliant small book called Identity and Violence. And it really just changed my perspective. Amartya Sen is a very important thinker in this field. He's not known, he's predominantly known for economics. He's not predominantly known for his work around identity. But he wrote this short book because he grew up in India during partition. And so he saw it firsthand. He saw how people turned on each other. His whole analysis is we need to have this idea of ourselves as multiple within ourselves. And then we need to be aware of that, not because we then have to pick one thing or try to make it all have a resolution, but we need to be aware of what's driving us at any given moment. So in one moment, you might feel that your allegiance to Coventry is really strong. There might be an event that's held. But then another time, you might be like, I'm really Punjabi and Punjab is really important to me. But there might be another time when being Indian is significant. Being British when you go abroad is like, I'm British, like cute. So all of this stuff, but being aware, this notion of not just accepting the complexity, but looking at it, not for a resolution, but to understand there are different things driving us at any one time, and that we're all of these things. And Amartya Sen's analysis is rooted in what he saw in partition, where people who had previously thought of themselves as brothers and sisters, what was activated was a binary choice where you're either Sikh or Hindu or Muslim, and there's this border now, and you've got to get on the right side of it, and you're going to pay with your life if you don't. And he saw it unfolding. And so identity and violence, his conclusion is, if you don't look at that complexity, and if people aren't encouraged, look at themselves as complex human beings, then they will descend into these binaries if circumstances take them that way. And that leads to violence and blood, which is what he saw as a young child. And I think it's really important. Yeah, you can never transcend these things. You can only look at them. But I think the thing is, with our culture, it's quite lonely. I mean, I find it quite lonely. I'm having this conversation with you, thrilled to be having it, because it's an opportunity to discuss something quite normal with somebody who understands or can see where I'm coming from. But I can't really just start these conversations
just on the street with any random person.
In the pub. Like, you have to. They're quite intricate as they are, and people need to have quite a bit of knowledge to even be or interest,
or even, and also to be able to kind of associate, like as in some of the family examples you wouldn't necessarily understand unless you've come from something that's a little bit similar, right? Yeah. Obviously, so you do your Cambridge degree in law. Your parents are super excited. You break their hearts and tell them you want to become a journalist. What I guess what I'm trying to get at is what happens between University of Cambridge and then Byline Times, because I think everyone, or not most people, will associate with Byline Times and everything that's come from Cambridge. Kind of, what is your route from graduating through journalism then to Byline Times, and also how, like you said that you've come out of Cambridge, you've been trying to transcend it whilst you're there. How does that then pan out for you as you're trying to figure out your career? Like, are you like, hold on, I need to keep this up because it's getting me somewhere? Or are you like, hold on, I'm having to portray myself as X to get to wherever, whereas actually I don't want to have to do that. Like, and if that was the case, at what point or what is it that makes you go, maybe I need to look at this a bit differently.
Yeah. So after Cambridge, those tensions within me were starting to simmer. The sort of the programmed Hardeep of that I was working towards Cambridge and law, and now I've done it, and I guess now I need to get a professional job in something else. It was still there, like quite strong. There's a lot of and then there was that tension was simmering with something that I guess I've always had, even since I was very young, like very small child. I've always had this sense that, and I think most people in the world have it. I just don't think they've been given the license to know that it's okay and that they can express it. That I've always had a sense that I had something to contribute to the world, in my own way, whatever that is. I'm still trying to figure out, yeah. And that was always, so I always had that as my core. Then there was like the Hardeep that's been programmed to do what is the right thing. And then by the time I leave Cambridge, these things are simmering. They're quite obviously in conflict. And I did these, like I said, I still for a while was like, maybe I'll give it a shot. So I did 10 interviews at city law firms, and it was just not good. I mean, it was just not the thing I should have been doing. I wasn't, and city law is so far from philosophical questions of justice. It's business work, and I'm not business minded. And so I was going to these interviews, and I knew they could tell I didn't really want the jobs. So I failed 10 interviews, and that was like quite a lot of things to go through. And then these tensions. And so I guess I spent a couple of years after that doing work experience. So I was all the time, I mean, as I said, I grew up in southeast London, half an hour away on a train from central London. So my parents, I could go back and live with my parents. I lived in the loft room at the top of the house. So I call it my loft years which were quite hard. There was no guidance as to how to get from A to B. And my parents couldn't really understand at that point, like, what are you doing? And are you getting a job? And I said, well, I'm going to try work experience because I'm not committed, but I can try out some things. So I started doing PR, communications work, press office work. And I did it for 2 years. And I was always a bit like, I'm not sure about this. I just don't think it's quite me, but it seemed like something, like communicating. I'm good at communicating. And then it all came to a head like 2 years on. My parents like, you should just get a job in one of these things now because you've got all the experience. And I was like, again, those tensions were really bubbling now. And I was like, oh God, like maybe, I think maybe. And as it happened, I got offered a job in one of these PR firms, a really good one in central London. And I took the weekend to think about it because I was, and then something weird happened. At that time in my life, there were 3 or 4 people who didn't know each other at all, who kind of came and contacted me or I interacted with, who all said I should be a journalist in like that 1 week. And the significant thing was I had this driving instructor, Tony Ben, that was his name. And I'd been learning to drive for like 2 years by this. So the whole 2 years I was doing work experience, I was trying to learn how to drive. I'm not a practical person. My mum insisted I do it. And I was like, okay.
If you say so.
But the best thing about the driving lessons, I eventually passed my test, but was that I would see Tony, Tony was like a witness to every week. I'd like have a lesson. And so he kind of, we chat about the work experience and stuff. And this one weekend where I had to make this choice about the job in this PR company, I couldn't do like a reverse turn around a corner. And we drove back at the back of my house. There's like some garages. We pulled up and he was going to drop me back home. And I just started crying. And he was like, what's going on? Is this about, this isn't about the reverse turn. And I explained, and I was like, now I've been offered this job and I have to make a choice, Tony, and my heart's not really in it. My parents are expecting, what do I do? It's been another 2 years. And I guess people don't realize that all this time you're living in a family where people don't understand what you're doing. And it's really hard to follow your own instincts within that. And then Tony listened to what I had to say. And he was like, you've got far too much integrity to be doing all these things you don't believe in. Why don't you just quit and become a journalist? I remember looking at him and it was quite sad looking back. And I said to him, that's so unrealistic. How can I do that? And he said, what do you mean it's not realistic? Because it wasn't realistic for me to be a journalist. I'd never grown up with that notion I could do that. And he said something I'll never forget. And he said that in life, he believes everything that you do, even if it doesn't quite work out, it's not a regret because you learned something from the experience. But he turned to me and he said, but I do regret the things I never even tried. And he talked about he'd grown up in Canning Town in East London and he liked being a driving instructor, but he felt he could have done more maybe in his life is what he was saying to me. And he turned to me and said, you've got to at least try. And it was like this, I always say seminal moment. This is my driving instructor. And then couple of hours later, didn't tell anyone about it. And my sister said, why don't you just stop the PR stuff and do journalism? And I was like, what? Journalism? And then someone texted me, my friend Ahmed, whose parents used to work at the BBC. And he was like, why don't you come and get them to show you around? Like, just for the sake, just fun.
Yeah.
I was like, why is everyone suddenly saying journalism? And I went with my instinct. And I turned the PR job down. And the lady who was offering it to me said, you're a bit old to become a journalist at 24. And I was like, well, it's my mistake to make. So I went, and then I got a job.
That's crazy.
So it literally was my own instinct, and something happened. And I went, and my parents like very worried, like, how are you going to do journalism? I was like, I don't know. And then long story short, I did a diploma, journalism diploma, which was a good start. And then got a job at a local paper called the Epsom Guardian.
Yes.
And I was there like a cub reporter and worked my way up to become an acting editor. Nice. And it was 3 years, and I really wanted to do that, like go into a community. You do potholes, local hospitals, crime, planning meetings, local council. You are a journalist,
everything.
Proper journalist. And I loved it. And from there, I kind of did 3 years there. And then those local newspapers are owned by big American companies, which people don't know about, and they're always making cuts. And it was time to leave anyway. So I briefly went to the Independent in London, and I didn't like that. It was very clickbaity, and their print edition was shutting down. It was all going online. So I went freelance, and just by chance, I started this little blog. And I used to write about criminal justice matters because, like, my law degree, I always loved criminal justice. So I used to start writing blogs about criminal justice. And then one day on Twitter, where it's still called Twitter then, like, I had a few thousand followers. Like, I wasn't, that known on it at all. I wasn't at all. And a lady who had seen one of these blogs was like, oh, you should just write these blogs for at Byline. And I was like, I don't know who these people are. Byline, at Peter. Like, I didn't know who these people are being copied in were. And then I looked at them, and it was a crowdfunded journalism website. And they got in touch. And then I met them, and within 6 months, they were like, we want to set up a proper newspaper and a news site, not a crowdfunded site, which was the beginning of Byline Times.
Okay.
That was the short version. Sorry.
Okay, no, that was, I was,
that's it. That's the whole thing. Yeah.
Okay. What made you want to, so I get the fact that life almost directed you towards journalism. I just think it's really interesting how everyone's saying you should become a journalist. And I can see why, because evidently even the work with Byline Times is just incredible. I guess my question is, at the start of it, when you first went into journalism, what was your expectation? Like, were you planning to try and, was your end goal, for argument's sake, wanting to set up something independent? What was your expectation getting into journalism? Because I think for any Asian parent, they're going to be like, well, hold on, at least with law, you're guaranteed a salary, you're guaranteed progression, you're guaranteed all of the good stuff. With journalism, you're going to have to come in zero, work up. Obviously, they're aware you have the ability, going to Cambridge is no small feat and graduating, so there's no question with that. But what was the game plan? Were you just
do you know what? No game plan. And maybe it's a really privileged thing to be able to say, but I'm always amazed when people say they love my work as a writer or as a journalist, because I didn't plan any of this. In a way, it's just, it's a path I've had to try and create. And I would like to think that's now created for other people too. So, I mean, journalism appealed to me anyway, just because I think this notion of, I said when I left university, I wanted to keep exploring in a wide sense, which is a very general thing. But just something where you're questioning and it's about the world around you. I'm really interested in the forces that shape us. And I would say my work now, 10 years into journalism, is the forces that shape us, whether that be politics, media, or these complex questions of identity, how they intersect. And I always wanted to make people think, and I always thought I'm good at questions and going deep. And I think I am good at that. So journalism is cool, but then again, like you say, the practicalities of it, I had no clue. And thankfully I had this diploma. So again, it seems like another problem solved. Great. And then go to the local paper. Great. And then I leave that. And then the natural progression is you go to London, you go to Fleet Street, as it's still colloquially known as. You go and work at one of the big national newspapers or the BBC. And the BBC turned me down, so I didn't get in there, which people find really surprising. It's really,
I bet you they regret it now, though.
I don't think I fit in any box. And the BBC is a great institution, but
it's a box.
It's a box,
yes.
And I don't fit, and I'm too questioning. and free thinking, I think. But I'm really grateful we have the BBC. And then so national newspapers, and then very quickly, even just briefly, my experience of it, it was just this isn't for me. This is not about being free thinking or questioning. It's just not for me, and it's a system in itself. And I don't fit there. And I never expected that. And I think that's what, again, the reality of journalism. And again, my industry doesn't talk about it enough. There's a big gap, like there is with anything, between studying law and being a solicitor. Between the ideals of holding truth, holding power to account and being a journalist. I know good people working in Daily Mail newsrooms and things because they have daily money for rent, and I get that. But the reality of what they're doing is very far from what they have in their heads. So it was never part of the plan to be like, oh, this isn't now. So now another thing, you get to it and you're like, oh no. So then that time I was really like, I went back to the loft and I was just like, oh my God, now it's piling up the things that I do and then step back from because it's not quite right. And then, like I said, purely by chance, this is the flow of life, I think. If you're willing to, in some ways, go down this path, there's some energy put out there, I think. And then I got put in touch with Peter Jukes and Stephen Colgrave, who, as I said, by this point, they were running a yearly event called Byline Festival, and a crowd-funded blogging site called byline.com. And it was all known for being independent journalism, which was also questioning of the industry of journalism. That's what it was even known for back then. And I met them, and they were like, so tell us what about yourself? And I told them everything. And I was like, so I don't fit really there, and I don't know. But the notion that we'd create, so they're the co-founders, I'm the editor that's been with them from the beginning. And the notion that I'd have to create a platform in order to have a platform
is crazy.
So people are like, oh, you don't write for The Guardian that much. I'm like, no, they've never commissioned or applied to my pitches. I'm being serious. And the problem is, if I feel this, I've always said this, if with all the privilege I've attained, and I admit I've attained privilege, I feel like I don't fit in journalism, mainstream, or what about all the people who didn't have the privileges I have in terms of Cambridge and getting a diploma and don't have parents who live in London? That's what worries me. And so this notion that I would have to create my own platform is difficult. I always think of it as, it's not just walking up the steps one by one. It's building the steps that you walk on.
Then walking them.
And to be honest, it is exhausting, but incredibly
rewarding.
Incredibly rewarding because it's your own path. And I think now I'm on my own path, and now I've got the path to the point where I'm like, even then it's like creating, and I love Byline Times. I'm really, really proud of its work. In terms of, again, this Hardeep that's programmed to strive, in a way I pulled it off again. So now I'm in my descent, which is, what do I want to do with that platform? I want to give it to other people. But what do I want to do with it? And I have begun, on Byline Times, exploring these complex questions of identity and not fitting anywhere. That's all in the heart of Byline Times. But again, now it's like, what do I want to use that platform for in a way that's not about striving or pulling a career off just to feel like, at least I've done that. I never would have imagined the path.
That you would have to do that.
No, not really. And again, I'm not looking for sympathy. It's my choice. My privilege to be able to do it. But I do think that it's quite lonely, to be honest. And to this day, you accept the trade-off. You accept the unsettledness and the uncertainty for this path. It doesn't make it easier.
No. You're just aware of those.
You're just aware of it. Again, there's no bow with a resolution.
We wish. My penultimate question, which is, I think a lot of people, Byline Times is obviously something that I came across on Twitter when it was called Twitter, and then have been reading bits and bobs over the years. And then I think the bit that really broke the camel's back in terms of really brought mainstream media's attention is obviously the stuff that was covered on Dan Wootton. My question from that is, how has it been being, so you're not one of the main newspapers, you're not The Guardian, you're not The Independent, you're not whatever, Daily Mirror or whatever, and I guess you don't necessarily have the same backing that they do. So for you, and I don't mean you per se, but as in you as in the Byline Times, to do a piece like that, or any piece that holds truth to power, how does that work for you guys, considering you're not an Independent, or you're not a Guardian, or you're not the Daily Mirror, or whatever it is? Surely there are ramifications for pieces like that? And like, how do you negate that, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, there are. Like, I'm really proud of the work we've done on Byline Times. And so it was set up 5 years ago. And so it's a daily news site that's free for everyone to access, and it always remain free. No adverts, no cookies. And then we have a monthly print edition, 68-page now magazine format, which goes into shops and is available via subscription to your posted to you inboxes or mailboxes each month. And our subscriptions, so people subscribe to the monthly print edition, and that funds all of our journalism. So my salary as an editor is paid for by our readers. So we have this transparency baked into the model of what we do. And it also gives us independence, because we don't have wealthy oligarchs or investment hedge funds or people funding us. We have the readers, and what we're saying to the readers is what we're giving you is independence. Not just in that we're not affiliated to any political party, but where it's an independence of mind. So I like to think people read a Byline Times article and don't feel like we're telling you what to think. We're giving you the information, and we've held the Conservative government to account. We get a Labour government, we'll hold them to account. I don't have any friends who are MPs. I don't socialise with them. I don't go to parties with other journalists. I sleep easy because I know that's true. And I will never forget that the readers fund me for that independence politically, but also of mind. So so when we set it up, we said where we report without fear or favour. And we always said that our main mission, the reason we've set it up, is we see a gap in the market. The investigative journalism in this country is sort of too scarce. It's not happening enough. If it is happening, it's too selective. And I always say that, for example, we have great investigative journalism in this country. Partygate is a great example of that, holding power to account with the Johnson government. But we shouldn't have gotten to the point where that was the scandal that forced him out. There were many, many, many other things, like, people in care homes being sent from hospitals into care homes, not being tested for the virus, coronavirus, for example, all kinds of other things, lots of other allegations of cronyism and conflicts of interest. So there was this selective notion of what is being investigated and what's not. And why is that? Because it comes back to who owns our press. And it's a monopoly of a few very rich, wealthy people who don't actually pay tax in this country. And it's their personal interest, in conjunction with people in positions of power politically. There's been this fusion. Those are the interests being advanced, not the public interest. All the time it's being dressed up as this is all for the public, but it's the opposite. And you can just see that. We had the phone hacking scandal, in 2011 to 12. That was just a very prominent example of the corrupting influences within the press. But our analysis always was the media is a massive power block in this country. It has huge amounts of influence still, not just in terms of how close it is to people in positions of power, but the culture in which we all swim in, the water we swim in, the culture is affected by now, not only newspapers, but social media, the whole news industry's merged. So this was the gap in the market. We were saying, not only will we give you the stories not being told elsewhere, but one of our core missions is to hold the press to account, the established press. And so from the get-go, we always said we do that without fear or favour. And the Dan Wootton story by two fantastic investigative journalists, Dan Evans and Tom Latcham, they had approached other established newspaper titles to run that story, and nobody would. They came to us, and it was kind of meant to be a very long-running thing that we were going to do. And then, to be honest, circumstances meant that things were coming out about Dan Wootton on Twitter, rumors.
Yes.
And we felt, actually, we need to do some work here and to set the story out. And yeah, when I remember doing it and thinking, we're not going to be backed by anyone else in the press. We're getting legal threats. We're funded by our readership. So if we need to, we'd crowdfund money for a lawsuit. I was aware that this was a big story to do and it was a big moment. But I also knew that if we didn't do what we say we always would do without fear or favour, then it was never going to take us into the next element of what we could do. And, to this day, we've been behind closed doors, lots of praise and plaudits from people who are in the mainstream media. When we say to them, are you going to run anything? Going to follow up? No, you never know where you're going to end up. We don't want to make enemies. So we're very much left on our own with it. Everyone knows it, by the way. This was an open secret in the media.
Yeah.
But I would always ask people to question, why doesn't the mainstream media want to report on this? Why does it take, compared to the resources of those big institutions, why does it take a reader-funded independent newspaper to do this? We will hold the established press to account. And I remember age 30 thinking, wow, I'm burning bridges then. But I don't regret it, because all of this stuff, the very notion that other papers won't report, shows the problem.
Yes, yeah.
That is the whole point of Byline Times.
Yeah.
So the more I do it, the more I just find extraordinary.
And it goes to show the need for Byline Times.
And you have to do it. You have to, at the end of the day, you have to say what you said you would do.
Yeah, and actually do it, follow through.
And I think that builds more community and support than anything. And for me, it was never personal. I've never met, again, as it should be in journalism, I've never met Damlin. I don't know anything about him personally. I have no animus against him because I don't know him. I just look at the information I'm being given and use that, as most journalists should do. The problem is, in most journalism, all of this entanglement happens.
Everyone knows
social
everyone.
Relationships, working relationships, and there's a lot of status to being in the established press. I don't care about status. I really don't. Like, I've done that too long in my life, trying to strive for that.
No, completely. My last question, because we have been going for almost 2 hours and I've only just realized, but what advice would you give, I guess hypothetically to yourself in this situation, but what advice would you give to younger people trying to get into this profession, like especially those from diverse or minority backgrounds? Like, what would your advice be to them? And equally, considering we've been talking about multiple identities throughout this whole thing, what would your advice be in particular to those people who, similar to yourself, entered this industry with various identities, and then I guess you tried to transcend it and now you're descending back into it? Like, what would your advice be, I guess, to them, and equally to the younger you? Now you can look back and go, well, it kind of all worked out.
I think what I really want people listening, people younger than me, our age, people who might want to get into journalism or just do something in public life or in the creative industries or in the arts, something that isn't expected of them, is don't be afraid to follow that voice inside, because that voice is inside. And again, that voice doesn't have to be a binary thing. That voice is a chorus, because it's like, I love being Indian, I like British culture, and actually I like journalism, but I love the law, the justice element of law, and maybe I could do that. Don't be afraid to listen to that voice, because for me, it's better to listen to it as soon as you can. If you're aware it's there. So I don't think, we all have it inside of us, but in some people it might not be as loud as in others. But if it is getting loud and getting louder progressively, do listen to that, because at the end of the day, it's going to save you so much time and so much of yourself and so much energy. Because for me, what it comes down to is you're only really going to be able to flourish and add what you're meant to in the world if you're in touch with that bit of you, that is separate from your family, your religion, your culture, what is expected of you, what is being put on you, the forces that shape us. And you've got to listen to that voice. And somebody gave me some really good advice once, because I'm very well aware it's not always as simple as that. It's not just, well, I want to do X. Well, how does that practically happen? You have to be able to think about living and paying rent, or, getting a house, a mortgage, and all these practicalities, which are also important in life. But someone gave me a really good piece of advice once, which was, Hardeep, don't think about the how. Just think about what you want to do. Listen to that voice and have a vision of what it is.
Yeah.
Because if you can hold on to that, I know this sounds a bit general and conceptual, but I do believe that if you hold on to that and you really clarify what that is you want to follow and keep listening to inside yourself, the world is going to give you that anyway. There's a flow to these things. And so the how, you end up finding a how if the what and the why and the who of what you are is really strong. And I would just encourage more people from our backgrounds, or anyone who has a lot of complexities within themselves and feels a lot of pressure they have to be one thing as opposed to who they are, and that's a universal experience, listen to that voice. Don't focus on how am I going to do it? What are the practicalities? Focus on what is it? Really get to know what that thing is. And for me, it's like, it's not even knowing exactly, it's not like painting a really detailed picture. It's just my what, who, why was, I meant to give something out in the world in my own way. I want to make people think a bit, think deeply about themselves, value themselves, think of themselves as interesting individuals, complex people, help them in some way in that sense. Again, like the rest of the detail is yet to be discovered.
Cut it in, yeah.
But you've got to listen to that voice as much as you can. You doing this podcast, fantastic example of it. It's been such a pleasure. I really think it's a great thing because you're listening to your voice. That's what you've got to do.
Yeah.
And just keep listening to that. And I think with journalism, it is the case now, which is great. You can turn the TV on and see diversity on screen. Also diversity in terms of the types of people, they're not all just from one social class. I think that matters. I still think we need to do more. I think in newsrooms, we still need more people in positions of power, editorial roles who are more diverse, not only in terms of color, but class, but region. But don't think of journalism, again, my message is journalism is something you can do. And law, accountancy, medicine, the world doesn't stop there.
No.
And it's okay. And you have to be okay with yourself, as long as you can say to your own inner voice, it's okay. No one else understands why I've left law and now I'm stepping away from the mainstream media and doing all this. No, that's fine. Comes back to what I was saying, Omar, you got to know your story. And that starts with getting to know your voice. And if you know that, it'll always take you in the right direction.
No, definitely. We've been talking for almost 2 hours, so I have to say thank you for all of that time. It's been absolutely amazing. I also have to just say thank you for just going with every single question that we were throwing out, because that was a lot. Like, we covered a hell of a lot in 2 hours. So thank you for all of that. I just want to conclude with asking, is there anything that you feel we didn't include or mention, or anything you want to just kind of... Anything?
I didn't think so. I think we really did touch on everything, but I appreciate you taking the time.
No, it's no problem.
It has been 2 hours.
Yeah. No, absolutely
really
fine.
Great to meet you, Omar.
No,
I think
likewise.
It's been I've learned so much, by the way.
Thank you so much.
As it should be,
Thank you so much. I will just